I'd like to start by thanking Adam and the whole Able Tech team for everything you guys are doing. I think this conference has gone off to an awesome start, and I'm sure we're going to have plenty of good stuff happening today as well. So, welcome everybody. Super quick introductions. My name is Chelius. My company is Chax Training and Consulting, and we specialize in document accessibility, right? So, you've heard a lot at this conference about web accessibility. Certainly part of that is documents as well, right? And my partner, Dax Castro, does anybody know Dax? By showing you, right? He's hard not to remember, right? I call us the Penn and Teller of document accessibility. I'll let you guys figure out who's who. But I love talking with people. You guys can reach out to me at chad@accessibilityunraveled.com. Actually, you can also reach out to me at chad@chaxtc.com. We're kind of migrating our emails right now, but feel free to reach out to me. I'm going to be talking today about creating accessible PDFs from Microsoft Word, okay? And I wanted to give you guys a couple of useful resources. Dax and I produce a podcast. We try to do it every 2 weeks. We've fallen a little bit behind, but you can access our podcast at chaxchat.com. ChaxChat is the name of our podcast. And our company, Chax, if you guys haven't figured this out, is a mashup of my name and Dax's name. We went with Chax. Somebody asked us why we didn't go with Dad. Might have been a good solution too, but. And then also, we have a super active PDF accessibility Facebook group. And I know some of you may or may not be on Facebook. It's almost worth being on there just to access this group. We've got 5,000 members to date, and they're just people who are trying to do the same thing you are, create accessible PDFs from various different types of documents. So please feel free to check those out. Super quickly, Dax and I started our company about 4 years ago now. And it was, I'm not going to bore you with the details, but he and I took a job at another organization thinking that it would be a good, career choice. It was not. In a year of employment, we did not get paid on payday 15 times. So it was one of those, right? You know what I mean? I don't want to bore you with that part of it, but Dax and I found ourselves on opposite sides of the proverbial table. And he's like, well, because we quit our jobs, right? We quit our jobs. And he's like, well, what are you going to do? And I'm like, well, I'm just going to go back to doing what I was doing. I said, what are you going to do? He's like, I don't know. And I was like, maybe this is our opportunity to give this a try, And so we basically put a flag in the ground and said, we're open for business. We opened a bank account with a zero balance. And we basically said, okay, let's give this a shot. And here we are today, 4 years later, and really, just enjoying what we do. I wanted to tell you guys, like, when we started our business, we founded the business on the principle that our main goal was just to help people, right? That's what our objective was, right? Obviously, we're trying to make a living at this, of course, but our main objective was we just want to help people, right? Because we know that there are challenges in this process, right? Accessibility, I'm going to say this later on, accessibility is not hard, but it does require us to do things a certain way to achieve success, okay? So, when Adam asked me to speak at this year's conference, one of his primary areas of focus was that he wanted to focus on the new Title II rule that was coming out from the DOJ. And I found it really interesting because a lot of people have come up to me and they're like, are documents included in that? And I'm like, yeah, they are. they certainly are. And so I don't want to spend, there's a lot of speakers at this year's conference who are talking more in depth about Title II. But I did just want to bring up a couple of sections of the Title II regulations that talks about documents, right? And so in the Title II regulations, they talk about conventional electronic documents. And that means web content or content in mobile apps that is in the following electronic file formats. So that's PDF, word processors, Microsoft Word, presentation formats, PowerPoint, and spreadsheet formats, Excel, right? So that's how Title II views electronic documents, right? So yes, right, guys, PDFs are included, in the Title II regulations. So as you guys heard, several of the speakers yesterday were talking about WCAG and how WCAG has become the guidance that most of these regulations are using to provide guidance in how to make content accessible, right? And so by and large, Title II is using WCAG as the guideline to making content accessible. Now, those of you in the know might be aware that in addition to WCAG, there's another standard for PDF documents called PDF UA. That is another standard that kind of guides us in how to make our content accessible. And somebody did reach out to the DOJ and they said, hey, you should also allow us to use PDF UA as a standard. And I highlighted this section. The DOJ declined to adopt that standard for that type of content. And they basically said, as discussed, the WCAG standards were designed to be technology neutral, and they're designed to be broadly applicable to current and future web technologies. So when you're talking about making your content accessible, WCAG is the guidelines that the DOJ is using, okay? So one of the unique components of a PDF document is that we can have fillable PDF forms, right? Very similar to fillable forms on the web. Basically, PDF forms are also part of, making content accessible. And you can see I highlighted this area here. It said that this may also be covered by the exception so long as members of the public do not edit the content contained in the official posted version of the document. And again, yesterday you heard this as well, where they're talking about there are exemptions to some of the documents. And, if the user is not expected to fill out the form, then that is not, you're not forced to make that accessible. But if it is a form, down at the bottom, you can see the exception does not apply to documents that are currently used to apply for, gain access to, or participate in the public entity's services. So if you're expecting them to fill out the form to apply for something or, sign up for something, that of course does need to be made accessible, okay? Does anybody have any questions so far? All right. Within Title II, there is also an exception for, and again, you heard this yesterday, archived content, right? I think it was Judith who mentioned this. She had said that, certain content that is no longer actively accessed can be archived. And we do not need to make that content accessible because, it's not important. The care you need to take is you do not want to update that document, right? Because the minute you make a change to that document, now we need to make it accessible. So keep that in mind. Awesome. And I'm so sorry. I told myself I was going to mute myself if I coughed, and that snuck up on me. The archived content, there are a couple of bullet points or number points that I put up here. If the content was created before the date that the agency must comply with the rule, that would fall under archived content. If the content is kept only for reference, research, or record keeping, that's considered archived content. And if the content has not been changed since it was archived, that also falls in line. All right, that's all I'm going to talk about with Title II. Oh, actually, one more thing, PDF exceptions. And again, I think it was Judith who mentioned this yesterday about if it's like a password protected document that is specific to a certain user, that would be an exception to the need to make that accessible. Awesome. All right. So let's talk about, creating accessible PDF files from Microsoft Word. A lot of you might ask the question, well, Chad, why don't I just post the Word document? Why don't I just make the Word document accessible? Well, that certainly is something that you can do. Some of the challenges we face with Word is the fact that A, it's very easily editable, right? So I post my Word document and it has, critical information in there. The user can change that, right? So that's a bit of a risk, for all of us. The other challenge with Word, and whether you guys know this or not, if I create a Word document that uses certain fonts and I send it out to the public and they open up that document and they do not have those fonts on their computer, all of those fonts get replaced. Did you guys know that? Some of you are shaking your head, right? A lot of people don't know that, right? And so you open up that Word document, you think this is what it was meant to look like, but in reality, everything has kind of changed and reflowed. So that creates a little bit of a challenge for us. So why do we use Microsoft Word? Like, what's the value? Well, let's be real. It's the most common tool used for document creation, right? When you guys need to create a new document, what program do you reach for? Is it anything other than Word? Go ahead, tell me. Google. Okay. So Google Docs, right? The challenge with Google Docs is there's no way to make an accessible PDF from a Google Doc without third-party tools. There is a product out there called Grackle Docs that is a plugin for Google Docs that allows you to make accessible PDFs from Google Docs, okay? So if you are in that situation, and again, there's a lot of organizations who are in the Google sphere, if you will, right? The Google ecosystem. There is a way to do it, but you're going to need some extra software to help you with that. Word is also just a logical tool for document creation, right? We all have it on our computers. We all use it every day. It's available on most computers. And Word does have built-in accessibility features, which is kind of cool, all right? One of the challenges, however, is to achieve success in creating an accessible PDF from Word, you need to know how to use Word correctly. And I'm curious, I always like to poll the room. How many of you actually had training on how to use Microsoft Word? Okay, overall, that's a fairly low number, isn't it? Right? And if we think back in our careers, right, and you think about that day you walked into work and there was this computer sitting on your desk, and they're like, this is what we're going to do now. We're going to use this computer. Figure it out. Isn't that how it worked, right? They're just like, there's a program on there called Microsoft Word. This is what we use to create all of our content. Figure it out. And we did. We did figure it out, but fundamentally what we did is we learned how to do it wrong. Right? We learned how to do it, but fundamentally we were doing it incorrectly. So we're going to be talking about that as I move along. The advantage of Word is that it's a natural choice for document creation, familiar, easy, intuitive. Word, what makes Word kind of nice to work with, as you all know, Word has a very natural top to bottom flow, okay? And that helps us because that ensures that the content in the PDF file is also in the correct order. And I will never tell you guys to go onto the WCAG website and start memorizing the success criteria. That's like a waste of your brain capacity, right? But there are two success criteria that is found in WCAG that we live and die by. And one of them is 1.3.1, info and relationships. Is everybody familiar with info and relationships? Right? Info and relationships is such a simple concept. It really just says tag content as what it is. If this thing on the page is a heading, tag it as a heading. If it's a figure, tag it as a figure. If it's a list, tag it as a list. That's all info and relationship says. But if we don't follow that guideline, we're violating that criteria and our content is not going to be accessible. And the second criteria is called meaningful sequence. And meaningful sequence simply says, make sure that you read content in a logical order if that order is critical to understanding the material, right? So you guys could imagine if you open up a page and it just starts randomly reading paragraphs in this crazy order, nothing would make sense. So we want to keep those two things in mind. Does Word have accessibility features? It does, right? As I'll show you a little bit later, Word actually has an accessibility checker built into it. And that's a really good tool that we can use to ensure that our content is accessible. The Word document itself can be made accessible. However, the PDF can be made more accessible than Word alone. Word actually doesn't understand some of its own features. And one example is in the case of tables. If you start merging cells in a table in Word, Word's like, I don't understand this. But in a PDF, I can make it understand it. So one thing I'd like you guys to take away from this session today is that some accessibility is better than no accessibility, right? Yesterday, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting everybody's names. Our first speaker yesterday, say it again? Devin, thank you so much. She had said, don't focus on compliance. Just focus on making your content accessible, right? And I really like that because we tend to focus a little bit too much on compliance rather than accessibility as a whole. Compliance is great. Compliance gives us guide rails and kind of steers us in the right direction. But there are also things that compliance forces me to do that between us in the room doesn't have a hill of a beans benefit to the end user. There's things that the standards force me to do. At the end of the day, doesn't really change much, you know? So I'm not stepping on standards. I think they're great. And as an accessibility professional, the standard is the only way that I can show my client that I've made a document properly accessible, right? We all love to see the green check marks, don't we? Right? We love the green check marks, and I do too. But you can have a document that is accessible and not be compliant. And that's the reality when you're exporting from Word to a PDF. Are you going to be compliant right out of the chute? The answer is no. I can definitively tell you, you will not be compliant. But will you be accessible and will you be free from significant barriers? Yeah, for sure. For sure. All right. One of the key things we want to keep in mind as we're building our documents is making sure that our content has significant color contrast. Okay. I consider this a super low-hanging fruit. This does not require a lot of effort on your part, doesn't require a lot of work. And all it really requires is that you as a human go through the document and ensure that any colors that you've used meets minimum color contrast. The requirement for text below 14 point is a 4.5 to 1 color contrast ratio. And then for text 14 point bold and above, it's a 3 to 1 color contrast ratio. Yesterday, Rob mentioned a web AIM tool that allows you to check for color contrast. And that's a great tool. I love that tool. I use that one quite a bit. The one I have on my screen is the color contrast analyzer. That product is by TPGI. And it's very similar to Rob's tool as well, but it's a great tool. I will tell you, any checker you use is not very good at checking the color contrast in your document. The pack checker does check for color contrast, but we end up with a lot of false positives. We end up with a lot of situations where it says it doesn't pass, but it does, or vice versa. So we really need a human to do that work, okay? So check your color contrast. Little tip, orange and yellow suck. Just avoid orange and yellow, right? And I know somebody yesterday, I think, pointed out to Lucy that the orange shirt she was wearing is the Oklahoma color, right? Yeah, there we have it. What you need to know is logos are exempt from the color contrast requirements. Yeah, logos are not part of that, right? Because we cannot dictate people's brand colors. Yes, sir. You have a question? Oh, sorry.
I just wanted to bring up that I threw a hand grenade in an organization that I belong to because the logo wasn't accessible. Had some red, had some light blue. The main problem was they were using those color combinations for like the website.
Yes.
Do the look of the website. So we'd have all this small red text that was not going to make the color contrast.
Yeah, no, and that's a really good point that you bring up, because although the logo itself is exempt, what companies often do is they'll reuse that color for elements within their, because they want to maintain that cohesiveness, right? But that's where you run into some challenges, right? Because like I said, yellow and orange are just brutal to, I mean, you have to make it brown. Like that's the only way it's going to pass. And nobody wants brown, right? Nobody wants to use brown. Oh, very good. Good. Let's give her a round of applause. I love that. I love that. Fight the good fight. Fight the good fight. I love it. No, that's fantastic. Oh, I'm so sorry. She said that she fought with WCAG to get them to lower the requirement to 4.5 to 1 so that her orange would pass the minimum contrast requirement. So she said over breakfast tacos, she did that. So that you're my hero. I love that. That's great. So I wanted to show you a quick example. On the left of my screen, I have 3 dots that are like red, green, and I guess like a dark blue. And then on the right, I'm showing those same 3 dots as observed by somebody who is colorblind. Okay. And somebody yesterday mentioned this, I think it was Rob, who mentioned the fact that, designers instinctively love to use green to indicate things that are positive and red to indicate things that are negative. The most common type of color blindness is deuteranopia, which is red-green color blindness. So if you use red and green to distinguish values, those colors may not be interpreted correctly at all. So in addition to color contrast, we want to keep colorblind values, in check. So I'm going to show you this. I'm doing some slides right now, but in a little bit, I'm going to bounce out of the slide and I'm going to dive into Microsoft Word and I'm going to show you some of these things that you can do. One of the requirements for accessibility is that all of our documents and our web pages too need to have a descriptive title. Okay, all of our websites, all of our documents need to have a descriptive title. Why? Well, because as we can all agree in this room, we don't tend to name our documents descriptively, right? A lot of times we use a job number, and then at the end, we'll add like the state that it's for. And then at the end, we always put the word final. Sometimes we put final. And sometimes final for sure this time, right? So the point is that our file names don't accurately describe what our document is about, so we need an appropriate title. Does anybody know what the most commonly titled web page is on the internet? And Christina, you can back me up on this. No, that would be better. Untitled page. Because a lot of the programs, Dreamweaver, Front Page, all the programs we used to use to create web pages, by default would call it untitled page. And the designer would never update that. And so that became the title of the page. I used to be able to Google this and it would show me the number of those pages. It doesn't work anymore for some reason, but it was like in the billions. Like it was a crazy number, you know? So yeah. I'm going to skip over this. I'm going to show this in Word. I'll show you where to add the title appropriately. One of the biggest things you could do in a document or a web page to make it accessible is to add structure to the document. The slide I have up right now is like a giant paragraph of 12-point type. And I don't know about you guys, but like when I see a page like this, I'm already tired before I start reading it, right? I'm just like, this looks like a lot of work. You know what I mean? This looks like energy I'm going to have to expend. And it's because there's no structure in the document. Now, this next slide, I'm showing a sample of my hometown newspaper, the Reading Eagle. I live in Reading, Pennsylvania. If you've played Monopoly, you know the Reading Railroad. No, it's not the Reading Railroad. If any of you thought that, it's the Reading Railroad. But when we add structure to the document, now all of a sudden, I have a method of processing that information. I have headings, I have photos, I have captions, I might have lists. You know, all of those things collectively make it a lot easier for me to process that information as a sighted user. But by adding that same structure in a PDF file, I'm giving users of assistive technology the same ability to process that information. When I tag content in my document as a heading, now a user of assistive technology has the ability to scan those headings. They can see if they want to read more about that section or that information. And so adding structure is critical. And I'm going to show you guys how to do this in Word. So this particular slide, I apologize, I should have made this a little bigger now that I'm looking at it. But basically, I'm just kind of showing you the way we add structure in a PDF file is using tags. And a tag is basically a way of just saying, this is what you are. You're a heading, you're a figure, you're a list. This is your role in this document, okay? And by adding those things, we make our document exponentially more accessible. What gives a document structure? I mentioned a bunch of them, but headings, images, captions, lists, tables, hyperlinks, all add structure to our document. Structure, as I mentioned, gives value to sighted users as it helps them to process the information, but it also gives value to users of assistive technology because it helps them do the same thing. I mentioned WCAG 1.3.1, info and relationships. This is a critical success criteria that basically defines what makes a document accessible. And then Another big one is adding alt text to our figures, because figures fundamentally have no value, right? All assistive technology knows is that it's a graphic. And so it'll voice it as a graphic, but that's all we know. And so when we add images in our document, we need to accurately describe them. Now, we also have the ability to artifact them. And so artifacting is a term that we use to say, this image has no value, let's just not read it. And occasionally we do this in documents. Sometimes in our Word document, we'll like to put a cute little piece of clip art that adds visual interest to the document. But fundamentally, do I want to describe that graphic? Maybe not, right? And Word has added a feature to the alt text area called Generate Description for Me. It automatically will generate alt text for your images. It sucks. It's bad. Most of my images say image of sunglasses or image of a sign, you know what I mean? And so it's not very helpful, and I encourage you guys not to use that feature. Don't think that it's the silver bullet, if you will. And adding alt text falls under WCAG 1.1 text alternatives. And it basically simply says, you know, describe your images. And when I say images, I mean photos, but that also applies to charts and graphs and pie graphs, pie charts, things like that. And those get a little trickier to describe, don't they? I mean, I'm assuming a lot of you have been sitting in front of the computer at times and you have a bar graph in front of you and you're like, oh my gosh, how do I describe this, you know? Dax and I teach a class called Writing Effective Alternate Text, where we walk you through approaches on how to properly describe things. And I'll give you a little tip here. The best thing you can do is ask yourself, what do you want the user experience to be? And if you can answer that question, that's going to guide you in how you want to describe that element, okay? One of the things that makes Dax and my approach a little bit unique is that we focus very heavily on the user experience. And we want the user experience to be a good one. And so we always keep that in mind and keep that at the forefront of what we're doing. And sometimes we'll break rules because it's going to provide the user with a better experience. Okay, so that's kind of our approach. Yeah. Does everything have value? Probably not, but sometimes it does. Charts and graphs, I'm going to show you a couple of quick examples here. On the left, this is a type of graph we often see. The challenge with the one on the left is that it creates a cognitive challenge because I have to create that connection between the color in the graph and the color in the legend. Like, I need to do that work. And that sometimes is challenging, especially for users who are colorblind. Now, the one on the right, I fixed by adding labels to the graph. And now the color is insignificant because I have an arrow pointing to each of the values telling you exactly what those values are, right? So that's how you can get around that. I'm going to show you a couple more examples. Line graphs are notorious, right? Especially from a colorblind standpoint, line graphs can be really challenging to interpret. And one of the ways that you can get around that limitation, you can see on the right-hand side, I added shapes to each line to distinguish them from one another. And now I'm not relying on color, because that is a WCAG, there's a WCAG principle called use of color. And use of color says you cannot use color as the only means of identifying elements on the page. Because if you do, you're violating use of color. So we can avoid that by using shapes instead of color alone. Awesome. Tables are another one. Every table should have a header row. If your table doesn't have a header row, it's wrong. Cue the laugh. But honestly, it is. Every table should have a header row that defines the category of the information in the table. So keep that in mind. But another question?
I may be kind of sort of jumping the gun, but can you or do you insert form fields? And are you doing all this under the developer tab? And my last question is, if I use a keyboard command to insert a heading, is it tagged or do I need to go another step? So 3 questions, sorry. Can you know how you can insert tables and graphics? Can you insert, okay, do you need to insert form fields if you want it to be fillable in Word? Or is that something that happens later?
Yeah, that's a good question. You cannot insert form fields in Word that will work when you export to the PDF format.
Okay.
So unfortunately, Word is not an ideal choice if you're building forms. If you are doing it that way, you're going to have to go into Adobe Acrobat to add those fillable form fields after the PDF has been created. And then your second question?
Okay. And then if you use a keyboard command to insert like heading level 1, heading level 2, is it automatically tagged as that? Or do I need to go like an extra
Yeah.
step to make sure that it's tagged, even though, you know, it's coded as a heading?
Yeah, so I'm going to show you this shortly. You don't really insert a heading, you style it using a word style. And that creates the connection between the text in your Word document and the tag that'll be applied when you export to the PDF format.
So the keyboard command would work then, right? Like if I highlighted a phrase and turned it into a heading level 1?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep. And then your third question?
Oh, no, I forgot.
You can't even remember
Oh,
it.
is all of this under do you have to be in the developer?
No. No,
Okay.
this is all just standard Word interface. And I don't know the keyboard shortcut to apply a style, but I could probably figure it out for you. Yeah. Or do you know it? Yeah, I know.
I use my finger, but it's like Control Shift and the number. So
Control Shift and the
1 is
number.
heading 1, Control Shift 2 is heading 2.
I may start using that, actually. That's really handy, right? Okay. So I open up a Word document on my screen right now. And you know, if you recall, one of the first things I mentioned to you is that you want to give your document an appropriate title. Okay. The way that we accomplish that in Word is if you go to the File menu and you choose Info. And when you do that, if you look off to the right, you will see that there's a column, and this is basically showing you all of the metadata in the document. Now, what I like to do, if you look at the very bottom, there's a little link that says Show All Properties. So I like to click on that so that I can see all of my properties. But right up here, you'll notice that there is a title. Let me see if this works. Oh, yeah. Maybe. How's that? You guys like that? So I'm zooming in on my screen to try to help everybody. But there's a field called title, a label called title, and then to the right there's a field in which we can add a title to the document. So I'm simply going to type here, Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. Both titles. So there's like a label called title, and then there's a field for the title. Yeah. So yeah, Philadelphia, city of brotherly love, go Birds. Like one person got that. Was that you, Chris? Philadelphia at night. Now, although the title is the only required piece of metadata, what I like to tell people is there's other metadata in here that are not required for accessibility, but will help with search engine optimization. It'll help your document get found when people are looking for it online. So for example, tags are like keywords, right? So I could type something like, city, Philadelphia, Ben Franklin, whatever makes sense, I can add that in there. You can also add a subject, right? I could call this the 2025 Philadelphia tourism brochure, something like that. Now, one of the things about the Office applications that I think it's worth everybody being aware of, when you create an Office document, you personally become the author of that document. And your personal name will get attached to that document and to the PDF that we create from this document. So if you ever Google your name, a whole bunch of documents from your company might show up because your name is attached to them. So one of the things we can do is if you hover over the current author, you can right-click and choose Remove Person. And then in the author field, you could put a more appropriate author. So here I might type Philadelphia Department of Tourism, and now that becomes the author for the document. Okay, so that's a really low-hanging fruit, super simple, super easy. Now the next thing I want to show you is a lot more critical, and this is how we satisfy info and relationships, right? What we're going to do is we're going to start adding structure to our document. So I'm going to scroll down a little bit. Here we have a big heading in the document that says Visit Philadelphia, right? Now, what I'm going to do, before I go too far, bear with me, I'm just going to do a Save As here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this as a PDF file. Now this is a critical part. How many people create PDFs by going to File, Print? Some of you, right? When you use File, Print, you will get 0 accessibility features. Your document will have 0 tags, no alt text on figures. It will in no way, shape, or form be accessible. So moving forward, instead of doing Print to PDF, choose File, Save As PDF. And that will incorporate accessibility. So I'm going to show you this. If I do a Save As, in the Format dropdown right here, I'm going to change that to PDF. And I'm going to go ahead and save that into my folder. There we go. And if I open up my tags pane, this is where you will see the tags that are applied to the content. And one of the new features of Acrobat is I can zoom in on these tags to make it a little bit easier for you guys to see. Now, you see we do have one heading here, but for the most part, if you notice that I don't really have any headings in this document. And that, of course, is violating info and relationships because I do not have content tagged properly, okay? So I wanted to show you that because the next thing I'm going to show you is how we add that structure. So what I like to do, you'll notice if you go to your Home tab, right here is my styles section. And I'm going to click on this little button here, and that's going to show me my styles in a list over here to the right. I think it's a lot easier to kind of see my styles that way. And I'm telling you, you guys are going to see this a lot, right? I'm clicked in that text. What style is applied to that text? Normal. I like to call it Abby normal. If you get that reference, you're old like me. But most people, when they use Word, they'll type the text, they'll highlight the text, make it bigger, make it bold, but fundamentally it's still using the normal style. And the normal style is always going to map to a P tag. And that's going to violate info and relationships. So watch this. This is what we could do. All of the default headings in Word, heading 1 through heading 6, will properly map to that appropriate tag in the PDF file. So what I'm going to do here, I'm clicked in the text that says Visit Philadelphia. I'm going to come over here to where it says heading 1. And I'm going to click on this arrow to the right, and I'm going to choose Update Heading 1 to match selection. And when I do that, you can now see that the heading 1 style is applied to that text. And now, when I export to the PDF format, that is going to map to the appropriate tag. I'm going to scroll down a little bit. Here's another heading, right? Now, this heading is currently mapped to title. Now, this was a new update in Word very recently, because for years, and when I say years, I mean years, I've been yelling at Microsoft because title would simply map to a P tag. I'm like, it's the title. It's important. Why are we mapping to a P tag? They recently updated it. And now the title will map to an H1 tag. So it actually works the way you would expect it to. So if I wanted to, I could have done that up here. I could click on this text and I could update title to match my selection. And now I'm making that heading the title. And then maybe I'll come down here. Oh, and what that did, that was already applied here, right? So let me apply heading 1 to that. If I can find it. Here we go, heading 1. And yeah, now I'm messing everything up. So I'm just going to undo that. And we'll leave this tagged as heading 1. And then this one, I don't want to be tagged as title. So I'm going to update heading 2 to match the selection. And now I have heading 2. Here's my table of contents, right? Now that, if I wanted to, I could apply heading 2 to that. It's going to change my formatting though. So I'm just going to kind of leave that as is. And then here we have another heading, right? Now we could apply heading 2 to that, right? Or we could make it, another heading level. And then we get down here, here's day 1. Maybe I'll update heading 3 to match the selection. And now I can use heading 3 throughout my document. So by doing, oh yes, we have another question. Go ahead, Lucy.
Are you interchanging heading 1 and title then?
You could.
Why would you? That's not semantically correct.
Well,
mean,
it all
title
depends
is
on how your document is structured, right? So what I could do, like the main heading in my document, maybe I'll map that to a title, right? And then the next heading in the document, depending on how it's used, I may want to map it to an H2, but if it makes sense, I could also map it to an H1.
So you're going to have multiple heading 1s in your document.
I am.
Eh.
And I challenge any of you to show me in the WCAG specifications There's always one in the crowd. Always one in the crowd. And some people are. Some people feel very strongly about only having one H1 per document. And I would argue that most of the time I would agree with you until I'm in like a document that's structured as a book, right? Where you've got a main title for the book and then every chapter has its own title. I would make the main title in H1 and every chapter title in H1 as well. That's how I would structure the document. Thank you, Lucy. I feel like my talk has been redeemed, now that Lucy agrees with me on that one. Any other questions about that? So yeah, again, there's no restriction. And again, I make this decision on a case-by-case basis, right? I would say in most shorter documents, I typically only have one H1. But as my document gets bigger, and I'll give you an example, I literally just did a document for a client that was 650 pages. And in that particular document, I absolutely had multiple H1s because in a document that big, if I use up an H1 and an H2 before I even get to the subheadings, I run out of headings. So me reusing an H1 gives me a little bit more latitude as I'm building the document. Yes, Lucy.
Where I find it obnoxious to have the two heading ones is if you have your document title, then you have the H1 right below it. You have H1, and that's where it becomes obnoxious.
Totally agree with you, Lucy. Like I would say having two headings in a row of the same level is no good. It logically makes no sense and it creates confusion for the user. So you and I are tracking on that one, Lucy. I 100% agree with you. And I'll tell you guys, one of the ways that most people accidentally create that problem is when they have a long heading and they want that heading to break at a certain point, like after a certain word. The biggest mistake you can make is putting a return there, because a hard return is going to break it into two separate tags. But if you use a soft return, which you do by pressing Shift Return on your keyboard, that will not create a new tag and it'll keep it tagged as a single tag. So keep that in mind. That's a huge way you can benefit from that. Awesome. All right. Oh my gosh, I'm running out of time. One more thing I'm going to show you guys, right? When it comes to graphics, right? So if you click on the graphic and then you right click and say View Alt Text, that's going to bring up your alt text panel off to the right where you can describe this figure, okay? The general guidance for alt text is keep it as concise as you can, still accurately describing the element, right? You do not want to write a novel in your alternate text, right? Right, Lucy? Because there's nothing more frustrating than having to read a novel of text to describe an image, right? You want to keep it concise, keep it straight and to the point. In this particular graphic, I'm going to say Gino's steaks, 4%. Tony Luke's, 6%. The alt text, the challenge with alt text is for users of assistive technology, they can't pause in the middle of reading alt text. They literally have to absorb all of that alt text and remember it all at once. And so for that reason, there are times, and I'm not saying I do this all the time, but sometimes I'll make the decision that it would be better for me to hide a table behind this figure that would allow the user to navigate the data in the table to be able to easily navigate through that information. That's a trick that we use that we can kind of achieve a better result by kind of putting a hidden table behind that figure. And then in the tag structure, I read the table instead of the figure. Okay. So I'm just going to write some basic alt text here because I don't want you guys to watch me do the whole thing. Gino's Steaks, 4%. Just going to keep it at that for now. And then all I want to show you guys, I'm going to do a save as to the PDF format. And what I want to show you now is that now when we look at our tag structure, can you guys see that now this content is tagged as an H1, this content is tagged as an H2, here we go. That is tagged as an H2, right? So by me adding the styles in Word, I've added structure to my document and created a much better user experience. And do I still have a minute, Adam? 1 minute? What's that? Oh, really? Oh, that's nice. So I'm going to open NVDA. I'm going to try to open NVDA. There we go.
Welcome. Okay. Unknown, Philadelphia, the city of. No next heading. No previous heading. Graphic page 2, no next heading. No previous heading.
I love when NVDA does not behave for me. Let's try this
Exit
again.
and oh,
Wasn't Rob saying this yesterday? How it's like sometimes you just got to like quit it and reopen it. Try this again.
oh, Philadelphia. No next heading. No next heading. Page 4. No next heading. No next heading.
Ah,
Graphic page 8, a city street with a large building and a clock tower description automatically generated.
so there you're seeing an example of it. Read the alt text for the graphic.
Graphic a city, graphic blank, graphic a city street with a large building and a clock. Exit, oh,
I love it when a plan comes together. But anyway, because I properly tagged it, typically how it would work if it was working correctly, when I use the H key on my keyboard, it's going to read the next heading. And that allows me to navigate through my document, reading all the headings. And that allows me to say, oh, right, I want to know more information about that section, right? It gives me the ability to navigate through my document and you know, tag the content correctly. Now, I know I mentioned tables, right, in my talk. You know, this was a table that I created that lists like a bunch of restaurants in Philadelphia, and they're legit restaurants. So if anybody wants to check them out, you can. But what I wanted to show you is when you click inside of a table, you'll get a new menu at the top of the word interface that says table design. And it's way over to the right there. And if I click on that, right, now you'll see on the left side of the screen, you've got two checkboxes. One says header row and one says first column. That's how you define header rows in your tables, okay? So the way I built this table, I've got a header across the top of the table, okay? And so over on the right here, if I turn on this first checkbox that says header row, I used a table style in Word. So by doing that, it also changed the formatting of the header row at the top. As you saw that it got dark and the text went white and everything like that. But by doing that, now that row of the table is going to be defined as a TH tag for table header. And then that information at the top that says restaurant name, address, and phone, that is a header for all of the data throughout the table. And basically, the experience that it creates is that when I read, for example, like this cell here that says Zahava, when I read that cell, it's going to say restaurant name, Zahava, because it knows that that's the header for that data cell. In some ways, like, I don't know about you guys, if you ever are on a web page looking through a table, do you ever like get down far in the table and you're like, what was that header again? And you got to scroll all the way up to the top and you're like, oh, that's what it is. And then you scroll all the way back down to where you were. Like, it's not a great experience, you know? But in some ways, this creates a much better experience because that header is always attached to the data. And as I'm navigating through the table, it's going to voice the header cell and let me know what the category is for that information.